I was supposed to endure a boring fake date just to pay off a debt to my sister. But the person sliding into the booth wasn't some nervous financial analyst. It was a woman in a tailored suit with piercing amber eyes I instantly recognized. Sloane Sterling, a ruthless billionaire and my sister's absolute worst nemesis. She leaned across the table, trapping me in her gaze, and whispered the one thing I never expected. The rain in Seattle always had a way of feeling personal, like it was trying to trap you exactly where you didn't want to be. Tonight, that place was a dimly lit, overly expensive restaurant in Belltown. I stared down at my phone, reading the text message from my older sister Chloe for the 4th time. Just smile, nod, and leave after 45 minutes. You owe me for covering your rent last month. I let out a long, defeated sigh and shoved the phone back into my purse. She wasn't wrong, but that didn't make sitting here any less miserable. I was supposed to be on a fake date with some guy named Greg, a junior financial analyst who needed to look settled for a promotion. It was a transaction, simple and entirely devoid of actual human emotion. I adjusted my wire-rimmed glasses, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place my plain white tee and oversized gray blazer felt in this room. The ambiance here was all hushed conversations, clinking crystal, and people who didn't check the price on the menu. I reached up, checking the messy low bun at the nape of my neck, making sure it hadn't completely fallen apart in the damp city air. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:15. Greg was officially late to his own fake date. I was just about to signal the waiter for the check and text Chloe that I had fulfilled my end of the bargain when the chair across from me scraped against the hardwood floor. "Sorry I'm late," a voice said. My breath completely stalled in my throat. It wasn't a nervous, apologetic male voice. It was low, smooth, and laced with a quiet authority that commanded the immediate attention of the space around us. I looked up, my hands freezing on the strap of my purse. There was no Greg. Instead, sliding into the velvet booth across from me, was a woman who looked like she owned the building, the restaurant, and possibly the entire block. She was wearing an impeccably tailored dark charcoal suit that hugged her shoulders with precision. Her dark hair was swept back, highlighting a jawline so sharp it practically looked dangerous in the ambient lighting. But it was her eyes that pinned me to my seat. They were a striking, piercing amber, currently locking onto mine with a terrifying amount of focus. I knew those eyes. I had never seen them in person, but I had seen them in photos, and I had heard about them in Chloe's furious, alcohol-fueled rants for the last 2 years. Sloane Sterling, high-end real estate developer, Chloe's former business partner, and her absolute, undisputed nemesis. Chloe had described her as a woman without a pulse. "She will smile at you while she dismantles your entire life," Chloe had warned me once. "Stay far, far away from her, Riley." "You're not Greg," I managed to say, the words tumbling out a little more breathless than I intended. Sloane leaned back against the plush velvet, resting one arm casually on the table. She didn't look like someone who had walked through the Seattle rain. She looked completely untouched by the elements. "No," Sloane said calmly, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corner of her lips. "I'm not." "Where is he?" I asked, gripping the edge of the table. "Greg had a sudden, overwhelming urge to be anywhere but here," she replied easily, waving a hand to dismiss a passing waiter who had immediately rushed over to offer her water. I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation crashing into me. Did you pay him off?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "I prefer the term reallocated his evening," Sloane corrected smoothly. She tilted her head, her amber eyes scanning my face, taking in my cheap blazer, my glasses, and the nervous tension radiating off my body. "You're Riley," she stated. It wasn't a question. Hearing my name in that low, deliberate tone made a strange heat flare at the base of my neck. Right, but technically, you shouldn't even know I'm here, I stammered, pulling my defensive shield up. And I shouldn't be sitting across from you. Technically, Sloane echoed, tasting the word on her tongue. She leaned slightly forward, the casual distance between us instantly evaporating. I make it a point to know exactly what my former partner is up to, she said, including the fact that she's pimping out her little sister for networking favors. I bristled at the insult to Chloe, straightening my spine. She's not doing that, it was a favor. It was a waste of your time, Sloane countered effortlessly. The waiter appeared again, looking visibly intimidated by Sloane's mere presence. Good evening, Miss Sterling, he said, his voice actually trembling a little. Your usual. Yes, David. And bring a gin and tonic for my guest, she ordered, not even bothering to look at the menu. I didn't say I wanted a gin and tonic, I protested as the waiter hurried away. You didn't, Sloane agreed, her gaze dropping briefly to my lips before rising back to my eyes. But you're chewing on the inside of your cheek, which means you're anxious. I immediately stopped chewing on my cheek. And when you're anxious, you need something bitter to ground you, she finished, leaning her chin on her hand. How did she know that? I stared at her, feeling entirely exposed under the dim pendant light above our table. She was everything Chloe had warned me about. Calculating, observant, and entirely too dominant for polite society. I should leave, I said, my voice lacking the conviction I desperately needed. I placed my hands on the table, preparing to push myself up. You could, Sloane murmured. She didn't make a single move to stop me. She didn't reach out. She didn't raise her voice. She just sat there, looking at me like I was a puzzle she had already solved. But if you leave now, you'll have to go back out into the rain, she pointed out softly. I have an umbrella, I lied. Sloane's amber eyes flicked to my small purse, which barely had room for my phone, let alone an umbrella. You're a terrible liar, Riley Vance, she said, saying my full name slowly, letting the syllables roll around in the quiet space between us. A shiver went down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the damp cold outside. Why are you here? I demanded, dropping the pretense of leaving for a fraction of a second. What do you want from me? I want to have dinner, she replied simply. The waiter returned, placing a dark amber liquid in front of Sloane and a perfectly crafted gin and tonic in front of me. Sloane picked up her glass, her long, elegant fingers wrapping around the crystal. Your sister spends a remarkable amount of energy trying to ruin my reputation in this city, Sloane said, taking a slow sip. I watched the movement of her throat, instantly hating myself for noticing. I figured it was only fair I finally meet the person she protects so fiercely, Sloane continued, setting the glass down. I don't need protecting, I snapped, crossing my arms over my chest. Sloane's gaze softened, just a fraction, but it was enough to completely alter the atmosphere at the table. It was a lethal, quiet kind of gentleness that felt entirely unearned and incredibly dangerous. No, Sloane agreed quietly. I don't think you do. She leaned in closer, the scent of bergamot and expensive cedar drifting across the table, wrapping around my senses before I could fight it off. So here is the situation, Sloane said, her tone shifting from conversational to absolute command. I couldn't look away from her. Greg is gone. Your sister thinks you are currently suffering through appetizers with a boring financial analyst. She reached across the table. For a wild, panicked second, I thought she was going to touch my hand. Instead, her fingertips brushed lightly against the condensation on my glass, pushing the gin and tonic an inch closer to me. You can walk out that door, text Chloe that the job is done, and spend the rest of your night wondering why I really showed up here. She held my gaze, the weight of her attention pressing down on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. "Or," Sloane whispered, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated right through my bones, "you can stay." She didn't blink. "You can drink that gin, eat an excellent dinner, and let me show you exactly why your sister is so terrified of me." The restaurant around us completely faded away. There was only the quiet hum of the rain against the glass, the smell of bergamot, and the terrifying, amber-eyed woman waiting for my answer. I knew I was supposed to stand up. I knew I was supposed to run. But my finger slowly unclasped from my purse, and I reached for the glass instead. The gin was sharp, cold, and tasted heavily of juniper and lime. It burned slightly as it went down, but it did exactly what Sloane said it would do. It grounded me. I set the glass back down on the damp coaster, my fingers lingering on the cold crystal. Sloane was watching me with a quiet, terrifying level of satisfaction. She didn't smile, but the amber in her eyes seemed to catch the ambient light of the restaurant, glowing with a predatory warmth. "Better?" she asked, her voice entirely too soft for the loud, frantic beating of my heart. "I'm not agreeing to anything," I managed to say, clinging to the last shreds of my practical, rational mind. "I'm just drinking the drink." "Of course," Sloane agreed effortlessly. The waiter, Data, returned with a bottle of red wine and poured a small amount for Sloane to taste. She didn't even look at the glass, just gave a brief nod, and he immediately filled it before practically fleeing the table. I couldn't blame him. The gravity at our table felt fundamentally different from the rest of the room. "If you're here to pump me for information about Chloe's new firm, you're wasting your time," I said, going on the offensive. I needed to steer this conversation into logical territory. "I don't work for her. I work for a completely different architecture firm." "I know," Sloane said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She set the glass down, her long fingers tracing the base of it. "You're a junior architect at Harrison and Hayes." I froze, my hand hovering halfway to my gin. "You researched my employer?" I asked, a fresh wave of defensive anger bubbling up. "I researched you," Sloane corrected, unbothered by my irritation. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table and steepling her fingers. "Chloe is predictable. She operates on emotion, spite, and a desperate need to control the narrative." Sloane tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over my face, taking in my cheap, wire-rimmed glasses and the rigid set of my shoulders. "But you, Riley, you are entirely different." "You don't know me," I argued, though my voice lacked the bite it should have had. "I know that you designed the preliminary sketches for the Mercer Island Community Center," Sloane said evenly. All the air rushed out of my lungs. That project was supposed to be my big break, but the senior partners at my firm had buried my name and taken the credit. I had never told anyone about that, not even Chloe. "How do you know that?" I whispered, genuinely shocked. "Because I own the development company that commissioned the project," Sloane replied, dropping the information like it was a casual off-for-a-fit about the weather. I stared at her, my mind spinning. Sloane Sterling was the anonymous backer behind the Mercer Island project? "The final design they submitted was uninspired," Sloane continued, her tone shifting into a sharp, business-like edge. "It lacked the natural flow and the structural elegance of the initial drafts. Your drafts." She held my gaze, and for the first time tonight, the predatory amusement in her eyes was replaced by genuine, unadulterated respect. "You have a brilliant mind for spatial dynamics, Riley. It's a tragedy that you let mediocre men hide your light." I felt a sudden, dangerous lump form in my throat. For years, I had been the quiet, pragmatic sister in the background, cleaning up messes and keeping my head down. No one had ever looked at my work, at me, and spoken with such absolute certainty about my worth. And the fact that it was coming from the woman I was supposed to hate was deeply, profoundly confusing. Technically, I started, my old habit kicking in to deflect the vulnerability. I'm just a junior staffer. It's standard industry practice for partners to take the lead on billing and credit. Sloane let out a low, breathy chuckle. It was a rich, dark sound that sent a very specific, unwanted shiver straight down my spine. There's that word again, technically. She reached across the table. This time she didn't stop at the condensation on my glass. Her index finger lightly grazed the back of my hand, a touch so brief and electric it felt like a static shock. I flinched, my breath catching in my chest, but I didn't pull away. "You use rules to protect yourself, Riley Vance," Sloane murmured, her voice dropping a full octave. "You hide behind technically and standard practice because it's safer than demanding what you actually deserve." She slowly withdrew her hand, leaving my skin burning where she had touched it. "But you aren't safe right now, are you?" She didn't need me to answer. The flush on my cheeks and the rapid rise and fall of my chest gave me away completely. Dinner arrived a moment later, breaking the suffocating tension, but the atmosphere between us had permanently shifted. We ate in a state of hyper-awareness. I found myself tracking the way she held her fork, the elegant line of her throat when she swallowed her wine, the intense focus she gave me every time I spoke. She didn't ask me about Chloe again. Instead, she asked about the structural integrity of cantilevered roofs, the history of Seattle's skyline, and things that actually mattered to me. She was dismantling my defenses brick by brick, and she was doing it with terrifying grace. By the time the plates were cleared, I felt entirely intoxicated, and I had only finished half of my gin. "Ready?" Sloane asked, already signaling David for the check. "I should pay for half," I said instinctively, reaching for my purse. Sloane didn't even look at me. She handed David a sleek black card with a simple, fluid motion. "I don't split the bill, Riley," she said, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for argument. "And I certainly don't let junior architects pay for my time." It was an arrogant statement, but it was delivered with such natural authority that I simply let my hands fall back to my lap. A few minutes later, we were standing up, moving through the restaurant toward the front doors. Sloane walked slightly behind me. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a solid, dominant presence at my back that made every nerve ending in my body stand on high alert. We stepped out of the warm restaurant and onto the wet pavement of Belltown. The rain had escalated into a steady, freezing downpour. The cold wind whipped my oversized blazer around my waist, and I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. "Where is your car?" Sloane asked, stepping out from the awning and smoothly opening a large black umbrella she had retrieved from the host. "I took an Uber," I admitted, feeling ridiculous in the freezing cold. Sloane took a step closer to me. She moved so fluidly, closing the physical distance between us until I was forced to step under the shelter of her umbrella. We were standing inches apart on the dark, wet sidewalk. The scent of bergamot and rain washed over me, dizzying and potent. She was taller than me, forcing me to tilt my head up slightly to meet her amber eyes. "Then I'll take you home," she stated. "You don't have to do that," I protested weakly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I can just order a car." Sloane reached out, her hand brushing the wet lapel of my blazer. Her fingers lingered there for a fraction of a second, the heat of her knuckles pressing against my collarbone. "I didn't hijack your evening just to leave you shivering on a street corner," she said softly. A sleek black SUV pulled up smoothly to the curb right beside us, the headlights cutting through the heavy rain. The driver stepped out immediately to open the rear door, standing at attention. Sloane looked down at me, the rain drumming a heavy, rhythmic beat against the fabric of the umbrella above us. "Get in the car, Riley," she commanded quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, wrapped in an order that I suddenly, desperately wanted to obey. If I got into that car, I was betraying my sister. If I got into that car, I was walking straight into the trap of the most dangerous woman in Seattle. I looked into Sloane's eyes, seeing the quiet, undeniable promise of ruin reflecting back at me. I took a shaky breath, tightened my grip on my purse, and stepped into the warm, dark interior of her car. The heavy door slammed shut behind us, completely sealing me in. The heavy door of the SUV closed, instantly cutting off the aggressive sound of the Seattle storm. Inside, the silence was thick and completely suffocating. The interior smelled like expensive leather, tempered by the sharp, lingering scent of Sloane's bergamot perfume. I pressed myself against the passenger door, trying to put as much distance as physically possible between us. It was a completely pointless effort. Even sitting on the opposite side of the spacious back seat, Sloane's presence seemed to consume all the available oxygen in the car. She tapped a button on the door panel, and a tinted glass partition silently glided up, separating us from the driver. My pulse spiked at the soft mechanical hum. We were completely alone now, sealed inside a dark, moving vault. "You didn't have to raise the partition," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't like an audience," Sloane replied simply. She turned her head to look at me. The streetlights passing by outside cast fleeting, rhythmic shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her jaw. She reached up and slowly unbuttoned the suit jacket she was wearing. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stare straight ahead at the leather seat in front of me. I heard the rustle of expensive fabric, and out of the corner of my eye I saw her drape the dark charcoal jacket over the center console. Underneath, she was wearing a crisp, perfectly tailored black button-down shirt. She casually rolled up her sleeves, exposing her forearms. It was such a mundane action, but executed with such deliberate grace that I found my chest tightening. "You're shivering," Sloane observed, her voice dropping into the quiet space. "I'm fine, it's just the damp," I lied, adjusting my oversized blazer. My glasses were completely fogged up and speckled with raindrops from the brief walk to the car. I reached up to take them off, fumbling slightly with the frame because my fingers were actually trembling. Before I could reach into my purse for a tissue, Sloane's hand moved. She reached across the wide leather seat, her long fingers elegantly plucking the glasses right out of my hand. "Hey," I protested, a weak reflex. "Relax, Riley," she murmured, pulling a small, soft microfiber square from the pocket of her trousers. Without my glasses, the world instantly blurred at the edges. The sharp lines of the car interior softened, but Sloane's amber eyes somehow remained perfectly, vividly in focus. She began to wipe the lenses, her movements slow and methodical. Being visually impaired in a confined space with a woman I was supposed to consider an enemy made every nerve ending I possessed scream in alarm. It was incredibly vulnerable. "Why did you really come to the restaurant tonight?" I asked, needing to fill the heavy silence. "And please don't say it was just to have dinner." Sloane didn't stop cleaning my glasses. "Chloe thinks business is a game of chess," Sloane said softly, her gaze focused on the lenses in her hands. "She thinks if she can outmaneuver my board members or steal a junior partner, she wins." Sloane finally stopped wiping the glasses, holding them loosely by the wire frames. She turned her full attention back to me, the amber of her eyes catching the dim glow of the dashboard. "But I don't care about the board members, Riley. I care about the foundation." She shifted closer to me. The leather seat creaked softly under her weight, a sound that sent a direct vibration right into the pit of my stomach. "I have been watching Chloe parade you around her office for 2 years, Sloane continued, her voice practically a whisper now. I watched you carry her coffee. I watched you organize her files. I watched you stand in the background while she took credit for your structural insights in meetings. My breath hitched. You were at those meetings, I asked, my voice barely audible. In the back row, Sloane confirmed smoothly, always watching. She leaned in, closing the physical distance until I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Chloe told you I was a woman without a heart, didn't she? Sloane asked. Yes, I breathed, entirely paralyzed by her proximity. She's entirely right, Sloane whispered, a dangerous, intoxicating smirk playing on her lips. I am absolutely ruthless when I see something I want. She lifted her hand, bringing my glasses up to my face. I instinctively closed my eyes as she gently slid the wire frames over my ears. Her knuckles brushed against my cheekbone, a deliberate, agonizingly slow caress that made a choked gasp slip past my lips. And I don't want Chloe's firm, Sloane finished, dropping her hand but staying exactly where she was. I want the architect who designed the Mercer Island project. I opened my eyes, the world snapping back into sharp focus. Sloane was inches away. I could see the faint pulse beating at the base of her throat, right where the collar of her black shirt rested. I work for Harrison and Hayes, I reminded her desperately, trying to cling to reality. I am under contract. Contracts can be bought, Sloane dismissed effortlessly. Firms can be acquired. I stared at her, my mind completely short-circuiting. You wouldn't buy an entire architecture firm just to get one junior architect, I said, shaking my head in disbelief. Sloane tilted her head, her amber eyes burning into mine with an intensity that completely stripped away my defenses. Try me, she challenged softly. Before I could formulate a response, the SUV slowed down, pulling smoothly to a stop. I glanced out the window, realizing with a jolt that we were parked directly in front of my apartment building in Capitol Hill. The rain was still violently lashing against the glass, making the street outside look like a blurry, hostile wasteland. Inside the car, it was warm, quiet, and terrifyingly intimate. The driver didn't get out. He stayed perfectly still in the front seat, separated by the privacy glass, waiting for a command. "This is me," I managed to say, my voice sounding incredibly thin. I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape the heavy gravitational pull of this woman before I did something completely reckless. "Riley," Sloane said. She didn't raise her voice, but the command was absolute. I froze, my hand still wrapped around the chrome handle. I slowly turned back to look at her. Sloane leaned across the seat, encroaching entirely into my space. She reached past me, her arm brushing firmly against my chest, and pressed a small silver button on my door panel. I heard the distinct, heavy sound of the child lock engaging. Panic and a sharp, sudden thrill of adrenaline shot violently through my veins. "You locked the door," I breathed, my back pressed flat against the leather. Sloane withdrew her arm, but she didn't retreat. She braced one hand on the back of my seat and the other on the door panel beside my side, effectively caging me in. "Technically," Sloane whispered, intentionally using my favorite word, mocking my defenses. "Greg didn't show up tonight." She lowered her face, her lips hovering mere inches from my ear. "Which means, technically, you still owe someone a date." A full-body shiver wrecked through me at the low, vibrating timbre of her voice. "I'm not going on a date with my sister's sworn enemy," I gasped, my hands balling into fists on my lap to keep from reaching up and grabbing her collar. Sloane chuckled, the dark sound vibrating right against my jawline. "We'll see," she murmured. She pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. She reached into the pocket of her discarded jacket and pulled out a sleek, matte black envelope, sliding it smoothly into my purse. "I bought the Mercer Island project back from Harrison and Hayes this morning. Sloane stated, the business-like edge returning to her voice, completely clashing with our physical proximity. My eyes widened in shock. The development committee meets on Monday at 9 a.m. at my headquarters, she continued. She reached across me again, her thumb deliberately brushing against my lower lip as she pressed the unlock button on the door. I expect the lead architect to be there to present her original designs. The door clicked, unlocking with a heavy thud. Sloane pulled back completely, returning to her side of the spacious back seat, smoothing her shirt as if nothing had happened. The sudden loss of her heat left me feeling incredibly cold and entirely unbalanced. "Have a good night, Riley Vance," she said, her amber eyes completely unreadable. I stared at her for one long, breathless second. I pushed the door open, practically tumbling out into the freezing Seattle rain. I slammed the heavy door shut behind me, standing on the wet pavement, my chest heaving as the black SUV seamlessly pulled away into the night. I was soaked, shaking, and completely terrified, because I knew, with absolute, undeniable certainty, that I was going to be at that meeting on Monday morning. The Sterling Enterprises building in downtown Seattle was exactly like the woman who owned it. It was sharp, towering, and made entirely of cold, unforgiving glass. Standing in the expansive marble lobby on Monday morning, I felt like I was voluntarily walking into a shark tank. My stomach had been twisted in a painful, agonizing knot for the past 48 hours. I hadn't told Chloe about Friday night. I had texted her that the date with Greg was perfectly awful, and that I went straight home to sleep. Lying to my sister felt like swallowing crushed glass, but the matte black envelope in my purse burned with an undeniable gravity. I approached the front desk, my palms sweating against the cardboard sleeve of my architectural portfolio. Before I could even introduce myself, the immaculately dressed receptionist looked up and offered a crisp, professional smile. "Ms. Vance, they are expecting you in the top-floor boardroom." She handed me a sleek, temporary access badge without me having to say a single word. Of course, Sloane had already paved the way. She controlled the environment before I even stepped foot in it. The elevator ride to the 50th floor was agonizingly silent, the pressure popping in my ears as I ascended above the city skyline. When the metal doors slid open, I stepped into a hallway lined with dark slate and minimalist modern art. A heavy, frosted glass door at the end of the hall was propped open, revealing a massive boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Puget Sound. It was 8:55 in the morning. I walked in, clutching my portfolio to my chest like a physical shield. There were 6 people already seated around the massive obsidian conference table, all of them older men in expensive conservative suits. They looked up as I entered, their expressions ranging from mild confusion to outright dismissal. "Can I help you, miss?" one of them asked, a man with thinning silver hair who looked like he had been born in a country club. "Are you here to set up the catering?" My jaw tightened, a familiar flare of irritation washing over my nervousness. "I'm Riley Vance," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm the architect for the Mercer Island project." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs passed through the table. "Harrison and Hayes didn't mention sending a junior representative," the silver-haired man muttered, checking his tablet. Before I could defend myself, the heavy frosted glass doors behind me clicked shut. The temperature in the room seemed to immediately drop 10 degrees. I didn't even need to turn around to know she was there. The heavy, intoxicating scent of bergamot and cedar rolled into the room, instantly commanding the atmosphere. "Ms. Vance is not here as a representative of Harrison and Hayes." Sloane's voice cut through the air, smooth, low, and perfectly lethal. I turned slowly. Sloane was wearing a structured bone-white suit today, a stark contrast to the dark charcoal from Friday night. It made her look untouchable, a terrifying beacon of authority in a room full of gray and navy. Her amber eyes swept the room, completely ignoring the men at the table, locking exclusively onto me. "She is here because I personally requested her presence," Sloane finished, walking past me toward the head of the table. As she passed, The sleeve of her white jacket brushed against my bare arm, sending a violent jolt of electricity straight down to my fingertips. Nobody at the table said another word. Sloane sat down in the high-backed leather chair, resting her elbows on the armrests, and looked at me expectantly. "The floor is yours, Miss Vance." I swallowed the dry lunk in my throat, walked to the front of the room, and connected my tablet to the display screen. For the next 20 minutes, I didn't think about fake dates, rainstorms, or my sister's raging vendetta. I talked about structural integrity, the flow of natural light, and the integration of community spaces into the surrounding landscape. I presented the project exactly how I had originally envisioned it, before the senior partners at my firm had stripped it of all its character. Throughout the entire presentation, Sloane didn't look at the screen once. She looked at me. She watched the way my hands moved when I described the cantilevered roof. She watched my posture shift when I defended my choice of materials. Her intense, unwavering gaze felt like a physical weight pressing against my skin. When I finally clicked to the last slide, I took a deep, slightly shaky breath and stepped back. Silence hung heavily over the obsidian table. "It's ambitious," the silver-haired man finally said, leaning back in his chair. "But it's expensive. And frankly, the firm's revised draft was much safer for our budget." He looked toward Sloane, clearly expecting her to agree with his pragmatic, cost-saving logic. "Safe is boring, Marcus," Sloane replied, her tone completely flat and utterly dismissive. She didn't raise her voice, but the reprimand was so sharp that the man actually flinched. "I do not pay millions of dollars to fund safe, boring concrete boxes that look like every other community center in this state." She stood up slowly, the movement fluid and predatory. "Ms. Vance's design stays, exactly as she presented it." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "But Sloane, she's just a junior architect. Are we sure she can handle the logistics of a build this size?" "If you ever question my judgment in my own boardroom again, Marcus, you will be finding a new seat by the end of the day." Sloane's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the devastating force of a tactical strike. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and completely submissive. I stood at the front of the room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. She was defending me. The woman who was supposed to be a heartless corporate monster was shutting down her own board members to protect my vision. "Meeting adjourned," Sloane announced, checking the platinum watch on her wrist. The men scrambled to pack up their briefcases, filing out of the glass doors as quickly as their pride would allow. Within 30 seconds, the massive room was completely empty, except for me and her. I began to gather my tablet and my portfolio, my hands shaking slightly from the leftover adrenaline of the presentation. I heard the distinct, heavy click of the boardroom doors locking. I froze, my fingers gripping the edge of my tablet. The quiet hum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound left in the massive space. "You came," Sloane said. Her voice sounded different now. The cold, corporate edge was completely gone, replaced by that low, vibrating timbre that had haunted my entire weekend. I turned around, leaning my lower back against the glass display screen. She was walking slowly down the length of the obsidian table, moving toward me with deliberate, unhurried steps. "I came for my project," I said, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. "I didn't come for you." Sloane smiled. It was a slow, devastating expression that completely transformed her sharp features, softening the ice into something incredibly dangerous. "You can lie to Chloe, Riley," she murmured, stopping just a few feet away from me. "But you can't lie to me." She stepped directly into my personal space, completely crowding me against the wall. The scent of bergamot washed over me again, wrapping around my senses, dulling my rational thoughts. "You were brilliant today," she whispered, her amber eyes dropping to my lips before slowly rising back to meet my gaze. My breath hitched in my throat. "Thank you," I managed to say, the words barely a rasp. Sloane reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the lapel of my jacket. It was the exact same motion she had used in the rain, a proprietary touch that made my skin burn right through the fabric. "Harrison and Hayes doesn't deserve you," she stated, her voice dropping lower, vibrating against the quiet air between us. "They keep you in a cage." She reached into the pocket of her white suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded document. She placed it on the table next to me, her hand resting flat against the dark surface, trapping me between her body and the wood. "What is that?" I asked, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "That is a contract to become the lead architectural director of Sterling Enterprises," Sloane replied effortlessly. I stared at her, completely stunned. "You want me to quit my job?" I breathed. "Chloe will literally kill me." "Let her try," Sloane murmured, a dark, protective edge bleeding into her tone. She leaned in closer, the bone-white fabric of her suit brushing against my chest. "Sign the paper, Riley." She tilted her head, her lips hovering mere inches from my ear, her breath warm against my skin. "Stop hiding in the background, and come work for me." She pulled back just enough to lock her predatory amber eyes with mine. "Because if you sign that paper," Sloane whispered, the undeniable threat of ruin wrapped in a seductive promise, "I will never let anyone take credit for you again." I stared at the thick white document on the table, feeling the invisible heavy chains of her gravity snapping securely around my wrists. The contract sat on my cheap IKEA kitchen table like a live grenade. For 3 hours I had done nothing but stare at the thick, cream-colored paper, nursing a mug of tea that had gone entirely cold. The terms were obscene. The salary Sloane had offered was triple what I made at Harrison and Hayes, with full creative control over the Mercer Island project and a dedicated support team. It was the kind of offer architects spent their entire careers bleeding for, and it was completely, dangerously radioactive. Taking this job meant declaring open war on my sister. It meant tying myself to a woman who terrified me, a woman whose mere proximity made my blood run hot and my rational mind shut down. I picked up my pen, rolling the cheap plastic between my fingers. My phone vibrated violently against the wood of the table, shattering the quiet of my apartment. Chloe's name flashed across the screen. My stomach instantly tied itself into a familiar, guilty knot. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Tell me you have access to the senior partner's server," Chloe demanded, bypassing any form of greeting. She sounded frantic, the background noise indicating she was pacing around her own office. "What? No, Chloe, I don't. Why?" "Because that absolute sociopath bought the Mercer Island development from your firm this morning," Chloe practically hissed into the receiver. I closed my eyes, staring blindly at the contract in front of me. "I need you to get into the server, Riley," Chloe continued, her voice tight with venom. "I need to know what her final bid was. I need to know how she maneuvered the board." "Chloe, I can't do that," I said, a slow, cold realization beginning to pool in my chest. "That's corporate espionage. I could get fired. I could lose my license." "Don't be dramatic, Riley. It's just a few files." "It's my career," I pushed back, my grip tightening on the edge of the table. "And besides, it's my design. She bought my project." Chloe let out a harsh, dismissive laugh that felt like a physical slap across the face. "Oh, sweetie, please. It's Harrison and Hayes' project. You just did the preliminary sketches. Don't be naive." The silence on my end of the line was absolute. Chloe thinks business is a game of chess. I watched you stand in the background while she took credit for your structural insights. Sloane's voice echoed in my head. Perfectly, devastatingly accurate. I need those numbers, Riley, Chloe pressed, completely oblivious to the massive shift happening inside my chest. You owe me for covering your rent last month. Just get it done. I have to go, Chloe, I said quietly. Wait, did you hear what I ended the call, tossing the phone face down onto the table. My heart wasn't racing anymore. Instead, a strange, terrifying calm washed over me, cold and clear as ice. I didn't owe her this. I didn't owe anyone my mediocrity just to make them feel comfortable. I unclicked a pen, pressed the tip against the heavy paper, and signed my name on the dotted line. It was 9:30 at night by the time my Uber pulled up to the Sterling Enterprises building. The rain had returned, a soft, relentless Seattle mist that clung to my hair and dampened my coat. The massive glass lobby was mostly dark, illuminated only by the sleek security desk near the elevators. I walked up to the guard, feeling entirely out of my depth, clutching the matte black envelope against my chest. I have something to drop off for Miss Sterling, I told him. He didn't ask for my name. He just looked at me, nodded, and pressed a button under his desk. Penthouse level, Ms. Vance. The elevator is unlocked for you. Of course she knew I was coming. She didn't just play the game, she owned the board. The ride up to the penthouse felt like a slow ascent into another dimension. When the doors opened, there was no hallway, just a direct entrance into Sloane's private office suite. The space was breathtaking. It was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, offering a panoramic, dizzying view of the glittering city lights bleeding into the dark waters of the Puget Sound. The only light in the room came from a single, low-set amber lamp on a massive walnut desk, and the ambient glow of the city outside. Sloane was standing by the glass, looking out at the rain. She had taken off the bone-white suit jacket. She was wearing a delicate, ivory silk camisole tucked into her tailored trousers, her dark hair falling slightly loose from its usually perfect style. She looked less like a corporate titan and more like a predator resting in her den. She turned around as the elevator doors clicked shut behind me. She held a heavy crystal glass with a single large cube of ice and a splash of dark amber liquid. "You're late," she murmured. Her voice drifted across the dark expanse of the room, sending an immediate, involuntary shiver down my spine. "I didn't realize we had a scheduled appointment," I replied, my voice sounding incredibly small in the massive space. "We didn't," Sloane acknowledged, taking a slow sip of her drink. "But I expected you to break about 2 hours ago." I swallowed hard, walking slowly across the plush rug toward her desk. I placed the black envelope onto the dark wood, sliding it slightly toward the center. "It's signed," I said. Sloane didn't look at the envelope. She set her glass down on a side table with a soft clink and began to walk toward me. Without the jacket, the sharp, muscular lines of her shoulders and arms were entirely visible. She moved with an effortless, fluid grace that made my breathing turn shallow and erratic. "Did you talk to her?" Sloane asked, stopping just on the other side of the desk. "Yes," I breathed. And you were right," I admitted, hating how vulnerable the words sounded in the quiet room. "She asked me to hack my firm's server to steal your bid numbers." Sloane let out a low, dark chuckle. Predictable. She walked around the edge of the desk, erasing the only physical barrier between us. Instinct told me to step back, to preserve my personal space, but my feet felt rooted to the expensive rug. She stopped mere inches from me. The scent of her bergamot rain and the warm, sharp notes of expensive whiskey completely enveloped me. "You're shaking, Riley," she observed quietly. "I just betrayed my sister, quit my job, and handed my entire career over to a woman who terrifies me," I whispered, staring up at her. "I think I have a right to be shaking." Sloane tilted her head, her amber eyes burning with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "I don't terrify you," she corrected softly. She reached out. Her warm, slightly calloused hand cupped the side of my neck, her thumb coming to rest just beneath my jawline, right over my wildly racing pulse. A choked gasp escaped my lips, but I didn't pull away. I leaned into the touch entirely against my own will. "The fact that you want more terrifies you," Sloane murmured, her voice dropping to a vibrating whisper that got straight to my core. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened my mouth to deny it, to throw up one of my practical, technical defenses, but the words completely evaporated on my tongue. She stepped closer, her body blushing against my front. The silk of her camisole was cool, but the skin underneath it radiated a dangerous, magnetic heat. She leaned down, her lips brushing lightly against the shell of my ear, sending a blinding wave of electricity through every nerve ending I possessed. "You don't belong in the background anymore, Riley Vance," Sloane whispered, her grip on my neck tightening just a fraction, a perfect display of absolute control. "You belong to me." She pulled back just enough to look at my face. My eyes were wide, my breathing completely fractured, entirely at her mercy. Her gaze dropped to my lips, lingering there for one agonizing, endless second. I closed my eyes, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of her desk to keep my knees from buckling, waiting for her to cross the final line. Instead, her thumb slowly stroked my jawline one last time before she stepped back, completely withdrawing her heat. "Report to HR at tomorrow morning," Sloane commanded, her tone shifting back to absolute authority, though her eyes were still dark with unspoken promises. "Don't be late." I stood there in the dimly lit office, entirely undone, realizing with terrifying clarity that I had just signed away much more than my career. My new office on the 49th floor was a masterpiece of modern architecture. It had massive floor-to-ceiling windows, an imported drafting table, and a dedicated team of 4 junior designers waiting for my instructions. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. And for the past 2 weeks, it had felt exactly like a gilded cage. The problem wasn't the work. The Mercer Island project was thriving under the massive budget and resources Sterling Enterprises provided. The problem was Sloane. Since the night I signed the contract in her penthouse, she had completely retreated behind an impenetrable wall of corporate ice. In meetings, she was ruthlessly professional. She addressed me only as Ms. Vance, her tone clipped, demanding, and utterly devoid of the dark, vibrating warmth I had heard in her private office. She was my boss. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, and I was her newest employee. Technically, any personal relationship between us was a massive violation of corporate policy, not to mention a devastating career risk for me. But every time she walked past my glass office, her amber eyes would flick toward me for a fraction of a second, just long enough to remind me that she was watching. It was a slow, agonizing psychological burn that kept me in a permanent state of high alert. By Friday afternoon of my second week, the tension in my shoulders was tight enough to snap a piano wire. The floor was mostly empty, the weekend already calling the rest of the staff away. I was leaning over my drafting table, aggressively erasing a structural line, when the heavy glass doors of my department violently swung open. "Where is she?" A shrill, furious voice echoed through the quiet space. My pencil snapped in half against the paper. I didn't even have time to stand up before Chloe stormed into my office, her face flushed with absolute rage. "You little liar!" Chloe hissed, slamming her expensive leather purse onto my drafting table. 2 of my remaining junior designers peeked nervously over their monitors, their eyes wide. "Chloe, you can't be here," I said, my heart instantly dropping into my stomach. "You need to leave." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice carrying easily through the open glass door. I just got off the phone with the Mercer Island zoning board. She leaned over the table, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of betrayal and disgust. They told me Sterling Enterprises officially submitted the final blueprints today, under your name. It's my design, Chloe, I said, trying to keep my voice low and steady, desperately aware of my audience. It's my firm's design, she screamed, abandoning any pretense of volume control. I gave you your career, Riley. I pulled you out of obscurity, and you stabbed me in the back for a paycheck. You took credit for my work for 2 years, I fired back, the years of suppressed resentment finally bubbling to the surface. You used me. Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the sleek office. Please, you think Sloane Sterling hired you for your talent? She looked me up and down, her gaze dripping with venom. Everyone in this city knows how she operates. She wanted to hurt me, and you were the easiest, most pathetic target available. My breath hitched, a cold wave of humiliation washing over me. You didn't earn this office, Riley, Chloe sneered, leaning in closer. Who knows what you actually had to do in her penthouse to get your name on that contract? The air in the room completely vanished. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of her accusation, the temperature in the office plummeted. Security, a voice commanded softly from the doorway. It wasn't a yell, but the sheer glacial authority in the tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. Chloe froze, her spine snapping straight as she turned around. Sloane was standing in the doorway, dressed in a sharp slate-gray suit. Her hands were casually tucked into her pockets, but her amber eyes were fixed on my sister with a level of cold, predatory fury that actually terrified me. Yes, Miss Sterling, a massive security guard responded instantly, appearing right behind her shoulder. Escort this woman out of my building, Sloane ordered, not breaking eye contact with Chloe. Sloane, you absolute bitch, Chloe snarled, trying to mount her obvious fear with outrage. You stole my sister just to spite me. Sloane slowly pulled her hands out of her pockets and took one step into the room. The oppressive weight of her presence instantly suffocated whatever fight Chloe had left. I acquired an asset that you were too ignorant to utilize, Sloane corrected, her voice deadpan and razor-sharp. She tilted her head, delivering the final, fatal blow.
If you ever step foot on my property again, or speak to my lead architect in that tone, I will have my legal team dismantle your firm piece by piece. Before lunch. Chloe opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She snatched her purse off my desk, her hands actually trembling, and practically ran out of the office, flanked immediately by the security guard. Silence slammed back into the room, heavy and ringing. I stood completely frozen behind my drafting table, my chest heaving, my eyes burning with tears of pure, unadulterated frustration. I hated that Chloe had said those things. But I hated even more that a tiny, insecure part of my brain wondered if she was right. Sloane didn't look at my junior designers, who were practically trying to melt into their chairs. She walked straight to my desk. Get your coat, she commanded quietly. I have work to finish. I choked out, desperately trying to keep my voice from breaking. Sloane didn't argue. She reached across the table, grabbed my coat from the back of my chair, and walked around the desk to stand directly in front of me. Now, Riley, she whispered, the ice in her voice cracking just enough to reveal the dangerous heat beneath. I didn't have the strength to fight her. I grinded to purse, keeping my head down as she led me out of the glass office and down the long, silent hallway. She didn't take me to the main elevator bank. She guided me to a discreet set of brushed steel doors at the end of the corridor, her private, executive elevator. She scanned her badge, and the doors immediately slid open. We stepped inside, and the heavy metal doors sealed shut, completely cutting us off from the rest of the world. The elevator began to descend smoothly, the silence between us stretched entirely too tight. I wrapped my arms around myself, a single, treacherous tear escaping and tracking a hot path down my cheek. Suddenly, Sloane reached forward and slammed her hand against a red button on the control panel. The elevator jerked with a heavy, mechanical groan, shuddering to a complete, violent halt. The digital floor indicator blinked out, leaving us suspended somewhere between the 49th and the ground floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. "What are you doing?" I gasped, taking a step back until my shoulders hit the cool mirror of the back wall. "I am stopping the car," Sloane replied softly. She turned slowly to face me. The corporate mask was entirely gone. Her jaw was tight, a muscle ticking violently near her ear, and her amber eyes were dark with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. She closed the small distance between us in 2 deliberate steps, trapping me entirely against the mirrored wall. "Do not let her words in your head," Sloane demanded, her voice a low, vibrating rumble that shook me to my core. "She's my sister," I whispered weakly, looking up at her. "And maybe she's right. Maybe I'm only here because—" Stop. Sloane didn't just step into my space. She invaded it. She raised her hands, placing them flat against the mirrored wall on either side of my head, completely caging me in. The scent of bergamot and adrenaline practically suffocated me. "You are here because you are brilliant," Sloane murmured, leading down until her lips were a fraction of an inch from my ear. "You are here because I want to watch you build things that will outlast both of us." She slowly dragged her nose along my jawline, a terrifyingly intimate gesture that sent a blinding shock of electricity straight to my spine. "And if you ever," she whispered, her breath hot against my trembling skin, "insult my professional judgment by implying I hired you just to get you into my bed again." She pulled back just enough to force me to meet her dark, predatory gaze. She reached up, her thumb aggressively wiping the single tear off my cheek, her touch rough and intensely possessive. "I will have to prove exactly how unprofessional I can actually be, Ms. Vance." My chest heaved as I stared at her, the heavy silence of the suspended elevator completely devouring any rational thought I had left. The silence in the suspended elevator was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Every single escape route I had ever built for myself completely evaporated. There was no, technically, left to hide behind. There were no board members, no junior designers, no spreadsheets to act as a buffer between me and the terrifying gravity of the woman caging me against the glass. Sloane was so close that the architecture of my lungs felt entirely compromised. I was forced to breathe in the exact same air she exhaled, a dizzying cocktail of bergamot, rain, and raw adrenaline. The mirrored walls of the elevator reflected our trapped forms into infinity, 100 versions of me entirely pinned by 100 versions of her. "Look at me," Sloane commanded softly. I hadn't realized I closed my eyes. When I forced my heavy eyelids open, I was met with the full, devastating force of her amber gaze. The corporate mask she wore all week was utterly annihilated. In its place was something feral, ancient, and undeniably hungry, stripped down to the sheer instinct of a predator who had finally cornered her target. "You think I brought you into my company just to play a petty game with your sister?" Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a vibrating register that hummed directly against my collarbone. I didn't," I stammered, my vocal cords betraying me completely. "Good," she murmured. She shifted her weight, stepping exactly half an inch closer. The fine wool of her slate-gray trousers brushed deliberately against my thigh, sending a violent shockwave of heat straight up my spine.
I gasped, my hands instinctively flying up to press against her chest to maintain some semblance of distance. It was the worst mistake I could have possibly made. Beneath the crisp white fabric of her tailored shirt, I could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of her heartbeat against my palms. She wasn't perfectly calm. She was burning, just as intensely as I was, simply hiding it behind a flawless facade of control. Sloane looked down at my trembling hands pressed against her ribs. Slowly, deliberately, she took her own hand off the mirrored wall and covered my left hand with hers. Her fingers were warm, strong, and entirely unyielding as she intertwined them with mine, pressing our joined hands firmly against the solid muscle of her chest. "Do you feel that, Riley?" she whispered, her gaze snapping back up to lock onto mine. I couldn't nod. I couldn't speak. "That is exactly what you do to me every single time I walk past your glass office and see you entirely consumed by your work." The confession ripped through the suffocating air, completely shattering the last remaining fragments of my reality. Sloane Sterling, the ice queen of Seattle real estate, the woman who supposedly had no pulse, was unraveling right in front of me. And she was unraveling entirely because of me. "Sloane," I breathed, her name slipping past my lips without my permission, sounding desperate and fractured. Her amber eyes darkened instantly at the sound of a name. "Tell me to step back," Sloane challenged quietly, her free hand moving to cup the side of my neck again. Her thumb pressed right over my wildly racing pulse point, feeling the exact chaotic rhythm she was causing. "Tell me to restart this elevator and I will walk you to your car, and on Monday we will go back to being nothing more than CEO and lead architect." She tilted her head, her lips hovering barely a millimeter from mine. I could feel the warmth of her breath ghosting across my mouth, an agonizing promise that she was refusing to fulfill until I made the choice. "Use your words, Riley, Vance," she ordered, the command wrapped in a devastatingly soft whisper. "Tell me you don't want this." I stared into her eyes, my mind screaming at me to run, to preserve my career, to hold on to my safe, boring life, but my body had already surrendered entirely to her gravity. I slowly turned my hand, lacing my fingers completely through hers against her chest. "I can't," I whispered, the admission tearing itself from my throat. A dark, triumphant hum vibrated in Sloane's chest. She didn't hesitate for another fraction of a second. Sloane's mouth crashed down onto mine, entirely erasing the space between us with a force that knocked the remaining breath completely out of my lungs. It wasn't a gentle, exploring kiss. It was a total, consuming occupation. Her lips were demanding, incredibly soft, but moving with an absolute, ruthless authority that commanded my immediate compliance. My hands flew up, tangling desperately into the lapels of her expensive gray suit, anchoring myself to her, just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Sloane groaned into my mouth, a low, guttural sound that completely short-circuited my brain. Her arm wrapped tightly around my waist, pulling my body flush against hers, leaving absolutely zero room for air or logic. I opened beneath her immediately, completely helpless against the sensory overload. She tasted like expensive dark liquor, sharp mint, and something entirely dangerously intoxicating that was uniquely her. The push and pull of the past 2 weeks completely detonated inside that confined space. Every stolen glance, every clipped email, every agonizing moment of forced professional distance poured into the desperate section of our mouths. She kissed me like she owned the very oxygen I was trying to breathe. My fingers slid upward, abandoning her lapels to grip the warm, strong column of her neck, my thumbs brushing the sharp line of her jaw. The texture of her skin beneath my fingertips was a stark, beautiful contrast to the rigid structure of her corporate armor. Sloane's hand moved from my neck, tangling violently into the messy bun at the nape of my neck, pulling just hard enough to force my head back and expose my throat. She trailed her lips away from my mouth, dragging a burning path of open-mouthed kisses along my jawline, down to the sensitive skin of my neck. I let out a soft, fractured whimper, my head falling back against the mirror. "Mine," Sloane breathed against my skin, the word entirely possessive, devoid of any corporate polish or polite restraint. She bit down gently on the junction of my shoulder and neck, sending a blinding flash of electricity straight to my core. I completely melted against her, my legs entirely losing their structural integrity, entirely supported by the steel grip of her arm around my waist. We were drowning in it. The boundaries were entirely gone, burned to ash in the heavy, bergamot-scented air of a suspended elevator. And then, suddenly, a sharp, metallic screech ripped through the space. Sloane reached out entirely blindly, without even looking away from my neck, and slammed her hand against the control panel. The digital floor indicator flashed back to life, glowing a harsh, blinding red. The elevator jerked violently, the sudden mechanical drop making my stomach plummet as gravity aggressively reasserted itself. The mechanical hum of the descent filled the agonizing silence. Sloane pulled back slowly. The physical separation felt like stepping out of a heated room into a freezing blizzard. I leaned heavily against the mirrored wall, my chest heaving erratically, my lips bruised and burning, my hair completely unraveled from its practical bun. Sloane stepped back into the center of the elevator. I watched, entirely mesmerized and slightly terrified, as she smoothed her crisp white shirt and adjusted the lapels of her slate-gray suit with fluid, practiced efficiency. Within 3 seconds, the feral predator was completely gone, locked away behind the impenetrable walls of the CEO. Only the slight flush on her high cheekbones and the dark, dilated pupils of her amber eyes gave away what had just happened. The elevator chimed, a cheerful, entirely inappropriate sound, as it reached the private underground parking garage. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the cold, concrete expanse and her waiting black SUV. I stayed pressed against the glass, entirely incapable of taking a step forward. Sloane stepped out of the elevator, her expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. She stopped just beyond the threshold and slowly turned back to look at me. The look she gave me was incredibly complex, a terrifying mixture of absolute satisfaction and a cold, strategic calculation. "Have a restful weekend, Ms. Vance," Sloane said, her voice completely smooth, perfectly leveled, and entirely corporate. She turned and began walking toward her car, leaving me standing in the open elevator. "Because on Monday," her voice drifted back through the cold garage air, echoing with a quiet, undeniable threat, "we are going to have a very serious conversation about your future." I stood entirely alone in the metallic box, shivering violently, realizing that I had just crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. The entire weekend was a fractured, agonizing blur. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was immediately transported back into that suspended elevator, feeling the phantom burn of Sloane's lips against my neck and the heavy, possessing weight of her hands. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was running purely on black coffee and a dangerous cocktail of anxiety and adrenaline. "We are going to have a very serious conversation about your future." Her parting words echoed endlessly in my skull as I walked through the sliding glass doors of Sterling Enterprises at 7:30 in the morning. The marble lobby was relatively quiet, with only a few early executives milling around the coffee stand. I bypassed them, heading straight toward the security turnstiles, desperate to get to the safety of my office before she arrived. "Riley," a harsh, familiar voice barked across the lobby. I stopped, my stomach instantly plummeting. I turned around to see Richard Hayes, the senior partner at my former architecture firm, practically fighting with one of the security guards near the reception desk. His face was flushed red, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and entirely unprofessional.
He shoved past the guard and marched directly toward me. "Mr. Hayes?" I asked, completely bewildered. "What are you doing here?" "I've been trying to get upstairs for 20 minutes, he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at the ceiling. "Your new boss has completely blacklisted my firm from every commercial development in Seattle."
I took a step back, the aggression radiating off him, making me incredibly uncomfortable. "I don't have anything to do with her vendor lists," I said quickly, keeping my voice low. "You need to leave." Richard let out a sharp, ugly laugh that echoed off the high marble ceilings. "You really think you're special, don't you?" he sneered, looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I don't know what you're talking about." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a vicious, venomous whisper. "You think Sloane Sterling hired you because you're some kind of architectural prodigy?" My breath hitched. "She paid us," Richard stated, the words hitting me like physical blows. I froze, entirely paralyzed. "What?" 2 weeks before she bought the Mercer Island project, her legal team approached us, he continued, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "She paid Harrison and Hayes $500,000 under the table to formally remove your name from the preliminary drafts." The bustling lobby around me completely vanished into a vacuum of silence. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not true. You took my name off because I'm a junior." "We took it off because she bought it off," Richard corrected mercilessly. "She manufactured the entire crisis, Riley. She forced us to humiliate you so she could swoop in, play the hero, and lock you into a contract." The security guard finally reached us, firmly grabbing Richard's arm to pull him toward the exit. "This whole thing was a transaction," Richard shouted over his shoulder as he was dragged away. "You were just the merchandise." I stood completely alone in the center of the lobby, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. My vision blurred at the edges. The validation, the respect, the intoxicating feeling of finally being seen. It was all completely fabricated. She hadn't just bought my project, she had actively orchestrated my destruction to ensure I had absolutely nowhere else to go. I didn't go to the 49th floor. I walked straight to the executive elevator, slapped my badge against the scanner, and hit the button for the penthouse. The ride up felt like an eternity, every passing floor fueling the burning, devastating rage building inside my chest. When the doors slid open, the penthouse office was bathed in the pale gray light of the Seattle morning. Sloane was sitting behind her massive walnut desk reviewing a document on her tablet, a steaming cup of black coffee at her elbow. She looked up as I stormed into the room, entirely unbothered by my sudden, aggressive entrance. She was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every inch the ruthless corporate titan that everyone warned me she was. "Ms. Vance," Sloane said smoothly, setting the tablet down, "you are 30 minutes early for a conversation." I walked directly to her desk, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the wood just to steady myself. "Did you pay them?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the immense weight of the betrayal. Sloane didn't flinch. Her amber eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of surprise. "Did you pay Richard Hayes to remove my name from the Mercer Island project?" I yelled, the volume of my own voice shocking me. Sloane leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her long fingers together. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't try to soften the blow, or lie, or deflect. "Yes," Sloane answered, her voice cold, flat, and entirely unapologetic. The single syllable felt like a knife twisting directly into my lungs. "Why?" I gasped, hot tears of absolute humiliation pricking my eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Because you were wasting your life in a cage of mediocrity, Riley," Sloane said, standing up slowly. She walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet away from me. You were letting those men steal your brilliance, and you were letting your sister dictate your entire sense of self-worth. So you decided to destroy my career just to control me? I shot back, taking a step backward, desperately needing space from her gravity. I didn't destroy your career, Sloane corrected, her tone sharpening into something fiercely dominant. I removed the obstacles that were holding you down. She took a step forward, completely unfazed by my retreat. I created an environment where your only logical option was to step into your own power, under my protection. That is sick, I breathed, wrapping my arms around myself as a violent shiver wrecked through my body. You manipulated my entire life, the fake date, the job offer, the elevator. The elevator was entirely real, Sloane interrupted, her voice dropping to that low, vibrating frequency that made my skin flush traitorously. Don't, I choked out, holding up a trembling hand to stop her. Just stop. I couldn't look at her. If I looked at her, if I let her predatory amber eyes lock onto mine, I knew I would drown in the toxic, terrifying truth that a sick part of me still wanted her. I quit, I said, forcing the words through the tight restriction in my throat. I am packing up my desk. You can keep the Mercer Island project. You can keep the office. I am leaving. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the elevator, desperate to escape before my legs gave out completely. You can't leave, Riley. Sloane's voice didn't rise, but the absolute chilling certainty in her tone physically halted me halfway across the rug. I slowly turned back around. Sloane had walked back to her desk and casually picked up the cream-colored contract I had signed 2 weeks ago. Section 4, paragraph 2, Sloane recited smoothly, not even needing to look at the paper. The non-compete clause. My blood ran entirely cold. It stipulates that if you voluntarily terminate your employment with Sterling Enterprises before the completion of the Mercer Island project. She looked up, pinning me with a gaze that promised total, inescapable ruin. You are legally barred from practicing architecture in any commercial capacity in North America for the next 10 years. I stared at her, the reality of the cage finally, devastatingly snapping shut around me. I hadn't just signed a job offer. I had signed away my entire professional existence. You wouldn't, I whispered, the fight completely draining out of me, leaving nothing but hollow terror. I would enforce it before you even reached the lobby, Sloane promised quietly. She dropped the contract onto the desk and walked slowly across the room, closing the distance between us until I was forced to look directly up at her. I couldn't move. The chains she had wrapped around me were invisible, but they were forged from absolute, unbreakable steel. She reached out, her cool fingertips gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The contrast between her gentle physical touch and the absolute ruthlessness of her actions was entirely paralyzing. Stop fighting me, Riley, Sloane whispered, her thumb lingering against my jawline. You are exactly where you belong. She leaned down, pressing her lips softly against my forehead, a terrifyingly possessive seal of ownership. Your office is waiting for you on the 49th floor. I suggest you get to work. I stood frozen in the penthouse, entirely shattered and completely captive to the most dangerous woman I had ever met. I didn't move toward the elevator. I stood exactly where she had left me in the center of the penthouse, my feet rooted to the plush rug. Sloane had already turned her back to me, walking smoothly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gray, rain-soaked expanse of the Puget Sound. She looked entirely calm, a flawless portrait of absolute victory. But I could see the rigid tension in her shoulders beneath the navy suit. She was waiting for the sound of the elevator doors opening. She was waiting for me to run, to retreat to my glass cage on the 49th floor and submit to the chains she had so meticulously forged. I took a slow, shuddering breath, the scent of her bergamot perfume still clinging violently to my skin. You're insane, I whispered into the quiet room. Sloane stopped.
She didn't turn around, but her posture stiffened imperceptibly. "I never claimed to be a good person, Riley," Sloane replied, her voice lacking its usual sharp corporate edge. It sounded tired. "I claimed to be the right person for you. There is a fundamental difference." I took a tentative step forward, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. "You destroyed my life," I said, my voice shaking. "You isolated me from my sister. You bought my career, and you threatened to ruin my future." "I saved you," Sloane countered instantly, spinning around to face me. The cold mask was cracking, revealing the dark, turbulent storm underneath. "I saved you from a sister who saw you as nothing more than an unpaid intern and a convenient bargaining chip." She took a heavy step toward me, the amber of her eyes burning with an intensity that practically scorched the air between us. "I sat in the back of those boardrooms for 2 years, Riley." Her voice was rising, vibrating with a raw, suppressed fury that was entirely uncharacteristic of the Ice Queen of Seattle. "I watched those mediocre, unimaginative men talk over you. I watched Chloe slap her name onto blueprints that possessed your soul, your brilliance." She closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from my chest. "Do you have any idea what it did to me?" Sloane demanded, her breathing actually fractured. "To watch the most brilliant woman in this city shrink herself down to make everyone else comfortable." I stared at her, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, devastating force of her confession. "I wanted to burn Harrison and Hayes to the ground every single time you compromised your own worth," Sloane whispered, her chest heaving. "So yes, I bought them. I bought the project. I bought the non-compete clause." She reached out, her hands gripping my shoulders. Her touch wasn't gentle this time. It was desperate, grounding herself to me as if she were afraid I would suddenly vanish into thin air. "I manipulated the entire board to make sure you ended up exactly where you belong. Right here. With me." Tears pricked my eyes, blurring the sharp lines of her beautiful, terrifying face. She wasn't just trying to control me. She was trying to worship me, in the only twisted, ruthless way a predator knew how. "You can't force someone to love you by locking them in a cage, Sloane," I said, my voice barely a rasp. Sloane stared down at me, the muscle in her jaw ticking violently. She held my gaze for one long, agonizing second, before her hands slowly, reluctantly dropped from my shoulders. The sudden loss of her heat left me feeling incredibly cold. Sloane turned away, walking back to her massive walnut desk. She picked up the cream-colored contract, the document that held my entire professional life hostage. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a heavy, brushed steel lighter. She placed the lighter exactly on top of my signature. "You're right," Sloane said quietly. She didn't look at me. She stared down at the paper, her profile looking sharper and more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "A cage is still a cage, no matter how much gold I line it with." She took a slow, deep breath and finally looked up, meeting my eyes across the expanse of the room. "Burn it." I froze. "What?" "Burn the contract, Riley," Sloane repeated, her voice completely stripped of its usual authority. "You can destroy it right now. You can walk into the elevator and you can leave this building." She stepped away from the desk, giving me a clear, unobstructed path to the lighter. "If you walk out that door, I will transfer the full ownership of the Mercer Island project to you, free of charge. I will never contact you or your sister ever again." My mind completely short-circuited. The woman who ruthlessly controlled every variable, who dominated every negotiation, was voluntarily handing me the weapon to destroy her entire plan. "Why would you do that?" I breathed, my eyes darting between the lighter and her face. "Because I would rather lose you entirely than watch you look at me with that terror in your eyes,"
Sloane confessed, the words tearing out of her. For the first time since I had met Sloane Sterling, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in her amber eyes. She was absolutely terrified. I looked at the contract on the desk. Freedom was sitting right there, one flick of a flame away. I could go back to my practical, safe life. I could find a new firm. I could escape the dangerous, consuming gravity of this woman forever. But as I looked at the lighter, a sickeningly hollow feeling expanded in my chest. If I left, the absolute devotion I saw in Sloane's eyes would vanish with me. If I left, I would never again feel the electrifying burn of her touch, or hear the low, vibrating timbre of her voice claiming me as hers. I didn't want to leave. The terrifying truth was that I had been desperately seeking this exact level of consuming, protective fire my entire life. I slowly walked toward the walnut desk. Sloane didn't move. She just watched me, her breathing completely suspended, waiting for my final judgment. I stopped at the edge of the desk. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold steel of the lighter. I picked it up.
Sloane closed her eyes, a microscopic flinch of absolute defeat crossing her features. I walked around the desk, moving directly into her personal space. She opened her eyes, confusion breaking through the resignation as she realized I wasn't heading toward the elevator. I stood directly in front of her. I took the heavy steel lighter and dropped it into the front pocket of her tailored navy trousers. Sloane's breath hitched violently. "Raleigh?" she whispered, staring down at me in pure shock. "Technically," I murmured, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across my face. I reached up, wrapping both of my hands firmly into the lapels of her pristine suit jacket. "Technically, I haven't finished designing the Mercer Island project yet, and I'm not in the habit of leaving a job half done." The silence in the penthouse shattered completely. A dark, incredibly triumphant sound rumbled deep in Sloane's chest, a mixture of a groan and a laugh that sent a violent shockwave straight to my core. Her arms completely engulfed me. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed my waist and literally lifted me off my feet, spinning me around until my back was pressed flush against the cool glass of the window. My feet dangled slightly, fully supported by the immense possessive strength of her body. "You're staying," Sloane breathed, pressing me against the glass, her amber eyes blazing with an entirely new, uncontainable fire. "I'm staying," I confirmed, tangling my fingers into her dark, perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely. "You're mine," she stated, her voice dropping an octave, entirely claiming me. "I'm yours," I surrendered completely and entirely willingly. Sloane's mouth crashed down on mine, eradicating the rest of the world. It was a kiss that held no restraint, no corporate boundaries, and no hidden agendas. It was raw, desperate, and tasted like absolute salvation. She kissed me like she had been starving for it her entire life, her tongue sweeping into my mouth with a demanding, intoxicating heat that made my vision swim. My hands gripped her shoulders tightly as she aggressively deepened the kiss, completely consuming me. Every single wall I had built around my heart completely dissolved under the relentless, perfect fire of Sloane Sterling. The Seattle rain beat a heavy, rhythmic tempo against the glass behind me, completely separating us from the rest of the city. I was entirely trapped in her gravity, securely locked inside the cage she had built exclusively for me. And as her lips trailed a burning, open-mouthed daff down my jawline, making me gasp her name into the quiet penthouse, I knew with absolute certainty that I never wanted the key. The rain kept falling against the glass, but locked inside her gravity, I finally found my absolute freedom. Thank you for getting lost in this story with me. I'd love to know where my voice reached you today. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.